The HOA thought they found the perfect sucker. Out of nowhere, they hit me with an emergency assessment for exactly $8,000 to fix the public street outside my house. They threatened legal action, fines, and liens if I didn't pay up immediately. But they made one massive mistake. They didn't read my property deed. In this video, I'm taking you inside the emergency meeting where I pulled out the ultimate legal trap card, saved myself $8,000, and watched the board turn pale. If your HOA is out of control, you need to see this. Nobody tells you when you buy a house that the real estate closing documents you barely skim, while signing your name 40 times might someday be the only thing standing between you and a lien on your property. I didn't know that yet. Back then, I thought the scariest thing about homeownership was the mortgage payment and maybe a broken water heater. I was wrong, so completely wrong that for 3 months my mailbox became a battleground of certified letters and my kitchen table turned into a makeshift legal war room. But I'm getting ahead of myself. When I bought my house on Maple Grove Circle, it felt like winning a small lottery. The market was brutal, bidding wars everywhere, people waiving inspections and offering cash they probably didn't have. I got lucky. The seller liked my letter, liked that I was a single teacher who wanted to put down roots, liked that I promised to keep the garden her late husband had planted. The house was solid, modest, a 1970s ranch with good bones and a backyard that got afternoon sun. The neighborhood seemed quiet, organized, the kind of place where people waved from driveways and kids rode bikes in lazy circles until the streetlights came on. There was an HOA, of course. There's always an HOA. But the fees were reasonable, the rules seemed sensible, and the woman who handed me the welcome packet at closing smiled warmly and told me they mostly just handled landscaping and snow removal. Easy. Simple. I signed the paperwork, got my keys, and moved in on a Saturday in June with help from 3 friends and too much pizza. For the first year, everything was fine. Better than fine, actually. I painted the living room a soft gray, replaced the ancient ceiling fans, planted tomatoes that actually grew. The HOA sent occasional emails about lawn care schedules and reminders to keep trash cans out of sight. I paid my quarterly dues on time, attended exactly one meeting where they discussed mulch options for 20 minutes, and generally kept my head down. I was busy. Teaching middle school English is the kind of job that follows you home, and between lesson planning and grading essays about summer vacation, I didn't have energy for neighborhood politics. That was a mistake. Not paying attention, I mean. Because while I was conjugating verbs and explaining metaphors, the HOA board was changing. Her name was Diane. Late 50s, retired from some corporate management position, the kind of person who wore blazers to backyard barbecues and had business cards printed with her title. HOA board president. She'd been elected the previous fall in an election I hadn't voted in because I didn't even know it was happening. Diane had plans, big plans. She wanted our neighborhood to shine, to have property values that made other subdivisions jealous, to run things with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 company. She started showing up at houses unannounced, clipboard in hand, taking notes about fence stains and mailbox angles. She created subcommittees. She sent emails with bullet points and action items. She talked about excellence and standards and community pride with the intensity of someone describing a military campaign. Trouble started with the roads. Our neighborhood had been built in phases over 2 decades, and the main streets were showing their age. Cracks spiderwebbed across the asphalt. Potholes appeared every spring like clockwork. It wasn't dangerous exactly, but it wasn't pretty either. Diane decided this was unacceptable. She got quotes from paving companies, presented a proposal at a meeting I didn't attend, and somehow got approval to move forward with a full resurfacing project. The cost was steep. Nearly $200,000 for the whole neighborhood. The plan was to split it among all homeowners as a special assessment, about $8,000 each, payable over 12 months. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in October. Thick envelope, official letterhead, the kind of mail that makes your stomach drop before you even open it. Inside was a breakdown of costs, a payment schedule, and a polite but firm reminder that per the HOA covenants, special assessments for community improvements were binding and enforceable. Failure to pay would result in late fees, interest, and ultimately a lien against the property. I read it twice, then a third time, trying to understand how my quarterly dues of $300 had suddenly become an $8,000 bill. I called the number listed at the bottom. A woman answered, friendly but scripted, and explained that all homeowners had received the same letter, that the project was approved by the board, that payment was expected by November 1st. I asked if there were exceptions, hardships, payment plans beyond 12 months. She said I could submit a written request, but approval wasn't guaranteed. I thanked her and hung up, staring at the letter like it might change if I looked hard enough. $8,000. I didn't have $8,000. I had a teacher's salary, student loans, and a car that needed new brakes. I had a savings account I was trying to build for emergencies, but this would wipe it out and then some. I felt that specific kind of panic that comes from realizing you're trapped by fine print you never really read. That night, I did what anyone does when they're scared and confused. I pulled out my closing documents, all of them. The stack was intimidating, easily 2 inches thick, full of legal language and notary stamps and initials I'd scribbled without really understanding what they meant. I made coffee, cleared the kitchen table, and started reading. Really reading. The mortgage, the title insurance, the inspection reports, the survey. And then I found it, the deed. It was near the bottom of the stack, recorded with the county, signed and sealed. Standard language mostly, describing the property boundaries, the lot number, the legal description that sounded like coordinates from a treasure map. But there was a section I'd never noticed before, a paragraph about easements and rights of way. And buried in that paragraph was a sentence that made me sit up straighter. The property includes frontage along Maple Grove Circle, a public right-of-way maintained by the city of Greenfield, not subject to private assessment. I read it again, then again. Public right-of-way, maintained by the city, not subject to private assessment. I grabbed my laptop and started searching. Property records, city planning documents, old subdivision plats. It took hours cross-referencing maps and legal descriptions, but the picture became clear. When the neighborhood was originally developed, the main roads, including Maple Grove Circle, had been dedicated to the city as public streets. The developer had handed them over decades ago. The city owned them, maintained them, plowed them in winter. The HOA had authority over common areas, the landscaping, the entrance signs, the small park at the end of the cul-de-sac, but not the roads themselves. My house sat on Maple Grove Circle, so did 15 other houses. We fronted a public street. The remaining homes in the neighborhood were on smaller private lanes that branched off roads the HOA did maintain and could legitimately assess for repairs. But not mine, not the main road. I felt something shift in my chest. Not quite relief, not quite anger, something sharper, clarity maybe, or vindication. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't trying to dodge responsibility. I just didn't owe what they said I owed. I sent an email that night to the HOA management company. Polite, factual, attaching copies of my deed and the relevant city records. I explained that my property fronted a public street, that I was willing to contribute to private road repairs proportionally, but that the assessment as written included costs for work I wasn't legally obligated to fund. I asked for a revised invoice. The response came 2 days later. It was not what I expected. The email thanked me for my inquiry but stated that all homeowners were subject to special assessments as outlined in the HOA covenants, that the project had been approved, and that my payment was still due by November 1st. No acknowledgement of the documents I'd sent. No explanation of how they'd calculated the costs. Just a polite brick wall. I replied again, more firmly this time. I cited specific sections of my deed, referenced the city records, pointed out that charging me for public street repairs wasn't just unfair, it was potentially illegal. I requested a meeting with the board to discuss the matter. This time Diane herself responded. Her email was 3 paragraphs of corporate speak that boiled down to one message: pay up or face consequences. She wrote that the covenants required all homeowners to contribute to community improvements, that roads were a shared resource, that my interpretation of the deed was incorrect and irrelevant. She reminded me that the HOA had the authority to place liens on non-compliant properties and that she hoped it wouldn't come to that. The tone was condescending, like she was explaining basic math to a child. I read it in my classroom during lunch, surrounded by half-eaten sandwiches and grammar worksheets, and felt my hands shake. Not from fear, from anger. The kind that starts cold and builds slowly. I printed everything. The deed, the city records, the subdivision plat, the HOA covenants, every email. I put it all in a binder with tabs and highlights like I was preparing a lesson plan. Then I requested a formal hearing with the HOA board. They were required to grant it per their own bylaws. Diane tried to schedule it for a weekday afternoon when she knew I'd be teaching. I insisted on evening. She suggested a phone call. I insisted on in person. Finally, she agreed. November 10th, 7 p.m. at the community clubhouse. I marked it on my calendar and spent the next 2 weeks preparing like I was defending a thesis. I researched property law, read case studies about HOA disputes, found examples of similar situations where homeowners had successfully challenged assessments. I practiced my presentation in front of the bathroom mirror, timing myself, smoothing out the nervous edges in my voice. I was terrified, but I was also ready. The night of the hearing, I arrived 15 minutes early. The clubhouse was a small building near the neighborhood entrance, usually used for birthday parties and book clubs. Tonight, it felt like a courtroom. The board sat at a folding table at the front. Diane in the middle, flanked by 4 others I vaguely recognized from neighborhood emails. They had coffee cups and laptops, the posture of people who'd done this before. I sat across from them, binder open, hands folded. There were a few other homeowners scattered in chairs along the wall, observers, curious or maybe facing their own disputes. Diane called the meeting to order with a brisk efficiency, reviewed the agenda, then turned to me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She invited me to present my case. I stood even though I didn't have to because it felt important to take up space. I walked them through it step by step. The deed language. The city records showing Maple Grove Circle as a public right-of-way. The history of the subdivision and when the roads were dedicated. I explained that I wasn't refusing to pay my share, just asking that the assessment be calculated fairly, excluding costs for streets the city owned and maintained. I kept my voice steady, my facts clear. I didn't accuse anyone of malice, just pointed out the error. When I finished, Diane didn't even pause. She said that the covenants were clear, that all homeowners benefited from neighborhood improvements, that the assessment was legal and binding. One of the other board members, a man named Greg, chimed in to say they'd consulted with their attorney and been assured everything was proper. I asked to see that legal opinion. Diane said it was privileged. I asked how the costs had been divided. She said equally among all homes. I pointed out that equal wasn't the same as equitable, not when some homes fronted public streets and others didn't. Another board member, a woman named Susan, looked uncomfortable. She glanced at the documents I'd provided, then at Diane, then back at me. She asked quietly if anyone had verified the street ownership before approving the project. Diane said it wasn't necessary, that the covenants gave them authority over all common areas. I corrected her gently. Roads aren't common areas if they're public, that's the point. The room got quiet, not the comfortable kind. The kind where everyone's doing math in their head and realizing the numbers don't add up. Greg broke the silence. He suggested they table the discussion, review the documents more carefully, maybe get a second legal opinion. Diane's jaw tightened. She said that would delay the project, cost more money, create confusion. Susan said maybe that was better than being wrong. Another board member agreed. Diane looked at me with something close to hatred, then said they'd take the matter under advisement and respond within 10 business days. The meeting adjourned. I packed up my binder, nodded to the observers, and walked out into the cold November night feeling like I'd just run a marathon. 10 business days turned into 3 weeks. I sent a follow-up email, no response. I sent another. Finally, a reply from Greg, not Diane. He wrote that the board had consulted with a real estate attorney who confirmed that properties fronting public streets could not be assessed for the maintenance of those streets. The assessment would be recalculated. Homes on private lanes would pay a higher share. Homes on Maple Grove Circle, including mine, would pay only for common area work, a significantly reduced amount. My new total was $1,200, still not nothing, but manageable, fair. I should have felt victorious. Mostly I just felt tired, but the story didn't end there. 2 days after I received the revised invoice, I got another letter. This one from Diane personally, not on HOA letterhead. It was handwritten, short, and bitter. She accused me of being selfish, of undermining the community, of costing everyone else more money because I wanted to be difficult. She said people like me were why neighborhoods fell apart, why property values declined, why nobody cared anymore. It was unhinged, personal, mean in a way that felt like she'd been holding it in for weeks. I didn't respond, but I did forward it to the other board members with a simple note. This is inappropriate. I expect better from our leadership. Within a week, Diane resigned. Quietly, no announcement, just an email from Greg saying the board was restructuring and thanking her for her service. The neighborhood app buzzed with speculation, but I stayed out of it. Some people reached out privately to thank me, said they'd had their own issues with Diane, that she'd been overstepping for months. Others were cold, blamed me for the increased costs on their own assessments, stopped waving when I drove past. The road project moved forward. The private lanes got repaved, smooth and black and perfect. Maple Grove Circle stayed the same, cracks and all, because that was the city's job and the city worked on its own timeline. I paid my $1,200. I kept teaching, kept grading essays, kept watering the garden. The neighborhood found a new rhythm, less polished, more honest. I learned that sometimes standing up for yourself costs you things you didn't expect to lose: goodwill, ease, the comfort of blending in. But I also learned that property rights aren't abstract. They're lines on a map, words in a deed, protections that only work if you know they exist and you're willing to fight for them. So here's what I want to know. Was I right to push back, or should I have just paid to keep the peace? When does community responsibility end and individual rights begin? And how many people are paying for things they don't actually owe because they're too scared or too tired to read the fine print? Drop a comment. Tell me your story. Because somewhere right now, someone's getting a letter they don't understand, and maybe they need to hear that it's okay to ask questions, to double check, to stand firm when the math doesn't add up.